So welcome everyone, good afternoon, welcome to today's Dial Global Virtual Workshop. I'm Rebecca and I'm the Community Engagement Manager here at Dial, and I'm delighted to be joined today by the incredible Simon Fillery. So Simon is Principal Consultant at SiFi Diversity, which is a company that helps organisations to develop a more inclusive culture. Simon's got a really excellent presentation for us today. So he's going to be touching on the topic of flexible working and its benefits beyond COVID-19. He'll also explore the impact of home working on particular employee groups and provide some key takeaways for us on how to build back better. So just before I hand over, I just want to mention, as most of you know, to include your questions in either the chat or the Q&A section, and we'll make sure they get answered both as we go along and at the end. So Simon, very warm welcome to you, and thanks so much for joining us today. I'll pass over to you now.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much for the warm welcome and good afternoon to everybody. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon just to share some of my learnings over the last few months. I'm sure you'll all agree it's been a bit of a roller coaster for lots of people, and particularly when we're thinking about the workplace and for office-based workers who have been working from home. As you can see, I'm working from home at the moment, but where people have been working from home over the last while, there's certainly been a step change really, I think, in the thinking around flexibility and actually what that means, and particularly when it comes to working from home. So today's presentation, as you were said, will be focusing around that, and actually what lessons can we take from everything that's come through, what positives have any of there been, and actually what can we try and do to try and make sure we can maximise the benefits that we've seen as we start to move forward into a post-COVID world. Before I do, let me just introduce myself very briefly. So as I was introduced there, so my name's Simon Fillery. I'm the Principal Consultant at SiFi Diversity, basically helping organisations to look at inclusion. Prior to setting up SiFi, I was working for, I was the Head of Inclusion at the Bank of England for 3 years and helped them to set up their diversity and inclusion agenda and integrate it with other programmes such as wellbeing and the work that they were doing around the community. And then prior to that, I was the global head for the investment bank at Barclays. And most recently, I've been working with quite closely with a client, GSK, as a consultant on a retainer, really helping them around all sorts of things. And flexibility has been one of those areas, and we'll talk about a little bit about some of that work in a second. So first of all, what is flexibility? Why is it important? Why is it part of the inclusion and diversity agenda? Why are we talking about this? Well, flexibility comes in a myriad of different forms. As you can see here, we've just picked out some of the from a word cloud, some of the things that people to associate when it comes to flexibility. Everything from phased hours to phased retirement to looking at compressing your working week. Looking at being more flexible about your working hours, job shares, working from home. All of these elements can come together to form what we will broadly term flexibility or flexibility at work. This presentation is going to focus primarily around working from home, although lots of the principles that we're going to be talking about can easily be applied to other forms of flexibility in the workplace. Why is it important from a diversity and inclusion perspective? Well, certainly the more flexibility that organisations have been able to try and build into their workplaces has been seen to really have benefit minority groups within the workplace, or groups that feel that they have some form of disadvantage. So certainly when you're talking about women, or you're talking about people with disabilities, or if you're talking about people from different ethnic backgrounds, basically there has been proven research to show that actually building more flexibility in means that actually you can create a working environment that actually people can adapt to. And actually the benefits from flexibility apply really across the board. Everyone can really benefit if you can get it right. So what's happened recently? Obviously we've had COVID. I mean, wow, you couldn't, if you'd have told me a year ago that we would all be working from home, that most offices wouldn't have been into them for the last 6-7 months. Yeah, it seems like a very, very different world to anything that we've ever seen before. And it really is been looked at as a real inflection point. to think about actually what's the purpose of the office. The office is a 20th century construction, late 19th, 20th century construction, when organisations started to grow. And they needed places to be able to try, organisations needed places where people could meet and share paperwork and lots of that bureaucracy around it. With the digital age that's come through, it feels like that the office has really sort of hung on as that place where people need to come together to be able to try and share work. I think that's going to be different now. I think COVID is really going to be this point where people start to think about, well, what do we really need the office for? What's its purpose? And why do we need to be able to come together? What do we need to be working 9 to 5 from an office environment anymore? So I think we're going to see some real changes as we start to come forward. And it's been a really torrid year for lots of other reasons as well. So with the backdrop of COVID, we've also we're going through Brexit here in the UK. And all the changes and problems that may bring, or opportunities as well, to businesses in order to be able to try and adapt. And within the diversity and inclusion space, we've seen really heightened agendas of conversations around things like race and ethnicity, with the Black Lives Matter movement really starting to gain a huge amount of traction globally in the wake of the horrific death of George Floyd earlier this year in the US. So there's a lot of conversations, I think, really at the moment about work, the place of work, and there's a lot of strains out there as well. So you only have to see the workplace. This used to be my workplace. So earlier in the year, I'm lucky enough, I live very close to central London. I cycled up to my old place of work, the Bank of England. And I can tell you, if you don't know the area, you would never usually see the Bank of England at Bank Junction with no traffic at all. I think there's like 2 people in this picture. It's incredible. This was a lunchtime in the middle of the day, in the middle of a working week. To see something like this is just sort of something, again, I'd never thought I'd see in my lifetime. And just some figures around this is actually, we're seeing a real, the UK in particular has been really slow in order to be able to try and go back into the workplace. Obviously now the lockdown measures and people are being encouraged not to go back into work again. But these are some stats that are pulled out from The Economist, really showing that actually Britain is head and shoulders above really our European neighbours in the fact that we've adopted working from home, and actually people are really reluctant to go back into the workspaces. And that's going to have all sorts of repercussions across the way that we try and work, and also for our city centres. Certainly you've heard a lot about this recently from some of our politicians, trying to encourage people back to work. And obviously that's now all had to be reversed as we started to see a second spike coming through. So what's some of the benefits? So what are some of the positive things that have actually seemed to have come out from the whole situation? So productivity is the key thing that lots of people have been worried about, and particularly managers who are used to having that face time to see what people are doing. This has been a forced experiment where some organisations have been really loath to adopt flexibility because their clients didn't do it. All of a sudden, overnight, everybody's doing it. So there's no excuse around trying to hide behind that. And what we've seen, at least certainly some of the earliest pieces of research that have started to come out, is that actually the productivity levels haven't actually dropped at all. So from an office-based environment, that actually productivity levels have actually held up. In fact, if anything, they've increased because there's certainly people who have been working slightly longer hours. And also that people have decided to be a bit more efficient about their time. We've seen that actually the number of meetings, that you can see this is on this chart here, again from The Economist, where they've been looking at actually the average length of the meetings has actually dropped around 15% because I think people are trying to do as much as they can via email. So productivity levels and actually spending lots of time in meetings, which sometimes can be, let's face it, a bit of a waste of time. Some of that time is now being gained back. And on the right-hand side here, these are just 2 images around two of those groups that I think are probably benefiting the most from this situation. Now, the research is just starting to come through about the impact for women. Anecdotally, so certainly there has been a huge amount of work that's been done and campaigns that have been put in place. that actually talking about that flexibility really has a really positive impact on women's progression in the workplace. So the BITC has been campaigning around flexibility to try and improve flexibility as one of the biggest barriers to women progressing in the workplace. I think time will tell around this. Certainly the initial responses is that actually the additional flexibility has allowed women to be able to try and adapt to the workplace. However, we've still got great inequalities in home life in the fact that actually men and women don't have equal responsibilities or are not taking their full share of responsibilities at home. So actually women are still having to juggle housework and child work and work. But the flexible working seems to help to offset some of the negatives there. The other group that probably has been benefiting as well, and I was talking with the Business Disability Forum, the UK's leading group around disability rights in the UK, is that the people with disabilities have actually benefited from being able to work from home more. Generally, people at home with disabilities aren't disabled by their environment as they are in the workplace. Certainly, in one of my previous employers, for example, but someone in a wheelchair had to get someone to come and help them to open a door because they weren't power assisted. So all of these small things I think will add up, and actually there could be some positives here that will come out of this for people who are different in the workplace. But certainly that's not a universal picture. And the responses from organisations to the crisis have been really, really varied. So just to give you a few headlines that I pulled out. Top one here from the BBC talking about warning of ghost towns if staff don't return to the office. Well, you saw that picture of central London a few months ago. I know it's got better, but I can't imagine it's anywhere near back where it was. And particularly in light of all the health constraints out there, it's going to be a long time coming. So it's going to be really interesting what the government response is. Mm-hmm. But from an organisational response, you can see here two ends of the spectrum around flexibility and about their responses to that. Twitter has said that actually employees will be allowed to work from home forever. So basically, they're going down the route of organisations like GitLab. My nephew works for a small software company. They don't have any offices at all. They get together for like a annual jamboree where they all come together and get to actually meet up face to face. But apart from that, he works from home 5 days a week and helps his wife with their kids. It works out very well for them. And this is the sort of model that Twitter has started to move towards as well, is actually encouraging people to be able to try and work from home where it makes sense. The other end of the spectrum is Netflix, who's Reed Hastings, who came out and said that there's no benefits from it at all. And actually, there are real negativities around the fact of not having that social interaction and not being able to try and make sure you've got that great corporate culture and those so-called water cooler moments of creation and innovation that can happen where you just have people meeting up within the office environment.
Yeah, Simon, I'm just going to interject there if that's all right. We've had one question through from Diksha who's saying, McKinsey have just released this report recently. So it's more than 1 in 4 women are contemplating what many would have considered unthinkable just 6 months ago. So things such as downshifting their careers or leaving the workforce completely. They wondered whether you had any thoughts on this or any guidance around this. Yeah.
Well, I think it's only natural. I think we've all had thoughts about actually how we're working and actually why do we want to work and where do we want to work. I think it's really, really natural to have those thoughts. My hope is that actually people can come to a conclusion where actually that they can use flexibility to be able to try and engage people in a different way. So if I use myself as an example, basically I was working as a consultant. I was working 5 days a week. Last year, I said that wasn't really what I wanted to do. I've been working 2.5 days a week since then. And actually for the last couple of months, I've actually been working from Spain. So actually I took the leap and went overseas just to get a bit more sunshine, if nothing else. But I think it's a really interesting thought. And actually, you can see why the attraction of actually being able to have a little bit more control and thinking about what you want to try and do. I think for me, I think actually having a wide range of flexible options and a really flexible workplace would encourage people to stay within the workplace and make sure that you don't lose that talent. Does that help, America?
Yeah, I think that's great. I think just on that as well, I think I love what you said about the water cooler moments, because that's so true, isn't it? It's hard, it's especially for like new starters. I think it's such a big thing for you to have a social life at work, and I think it must be really hard for employers to manage that now virtually.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's and you're right. I think for new starters, for apprentices, for graduate employees, for industrial placement students who really want to try and learn on the job, and we'll touch a little bit on this later, it's really, really important, I think, to have those connections. And there are ways to be able to try and create that virtually. And I don't think anybody would ever advocate that we should all never meet at all and everything should be virtual. But I think it's about being thoughtful about why we're coming together and what we need to come together for now, and really to have those adult conversations. And certainly that'll be the thrust of my response in a second. So we'll come on to that in a minute. So we were talking about actually some of the negative things about working from home and about the current environment, and actually what's going to be the outcome of it. So this is coming back better. So this is really the section I really want to try and talk a little bit about some of those watch outs. So what are some of the negativities that we've seen? And we've touched a little bit on some of this already. So working from home, I think one of the biggest things that I've seen, and I felt it, I know other people have as well, is isolation, and not having a great environment. I mean, Rebecca and I were talking about this yesterday, where about actually not having a fixed working space that you could come to, and actually not having a desk, all of that good stuff actually can be a bit depressing if you're trying to work on a bed, or you're working on a couch, or you haven't got a great workspace. But also not having that social interaction, particularly for people who live on their own. Work can be a great social place for social interactions, and that's all gone. So I think, again, so we need to be thoughtful about actually how do we try and support people who have different family structures and different living arrangements to make sure that they are supported in the right way when we start to bring people back into the workplace. I think that there are, beyond that mental health piece, and actually thinking about people's mental health and thinking about what the working environment will look like. There are some other groups, I think, that are going to be potentially struggling to be able to try and coming back into the workforce. So I think we just need to be thoughtful about, particularly about that mental health issue, about how we're bringing people back. From a cultural perspective, there are a number of different issues, and again, thinking about that, how do you try and create and inculcate a really great inclusive culture that most organizations are trying to do? How do you do that when you have got people remotely and you're gathering perhaps for a team Zoom call once a week for an hour? Really, really difficult to try and keep that culture going, and really difficult to try and think about how you try and break some of the bad habits that can start to come in, where people don't stop talking to each other. And that's the worst of all worlds. We've got all the technologies, this is a great example here, but we've got all the technologies to be able to try and do that. And so there's a real risk to culture that actually we end up with either people being excluded, different groups being segregated and moved away, or like having like an integrated group where people of difference are actually treated in a very, very different way, rather than this sort of homogenized idea of everybody being treated fairly and equally and everyone being included in the conversations. So culture is going to be really, really important, and thinking about how do we try and create those mechanisms to create those water cooler moments and make sure people feel included in the work that's coming through. So thinking about actually where we're trying to go to, and actually so thinking about, well, what do we need to try and think about to make sure that we can create and overcome some of the problems or some of the issues that we may be facing in the workplace as we start to come back. Well, the first, so as I mentioned, I've been working with GSK. I did a similar thing actually at the Bank of England, where we looked at our policies, basically making sure that our policies are super easy to understand, I'm sure GSK won't mind me saying that they had a long policy for flexible working. It was around 16 pages. We've got that down to 3. We've got a great frequently asked questions document in order to be able to try and answer all those questions that most people will have. We've got an infographic now to be able to try and help direct people, to try and make it as easy as possible for people to be able to try and access and understand how the policy works. We've also tried to make it as open as possible. So really trying to allow people to come up with their own model that's going to work for them. And to be creative. We're encouraging people to really start thinking about and really trying to be creative about what sort of response and how they want to be able to try and come back into the workplace. And this comes back to this second point, which is this idea that we mentioned before around having the right conversations. So we really need to be able to make sure that as we're coming back into the workplace, that we are starting to have the right conversations between individuals, between individual and manager, or colleague and manager, and then between teams and managers. So we really need to try and make sure we're creating that right environment in order to be able to, for people to be able to come through. And that starts by having really open and honest conversations. So we're doing some work, I've been doing some work at the moment where we've had some great comms that have come out from senior management talking about coming back into the workplace, understanding that people are nervous, understanding that people are the top priority of the organisation. But then what we've then tried to do is think about how do we support managers to have those really good conversations with people on a one-to-one basis, and then also as a team. And it's something people forget when you're starting to talk about flexibility. It can have, when you're starting to think about people working in a very, very different way, it can be quite easy to have that one-to-one conversation, but actually that will have an impact on the whole team when someone starts to work differently. So thinking and actually getting the team together to have an adult conversation about actually, okay, look, we're going to start working differently. What are the things that we really need to be able to try and do together? What are those red lines where we need to have the team meetings and things in place? Are we going to have like a monthly social? What are those things that actually, and really encouraging people to try and have that really open and honest conversation between them all so that you can agree a way of working as we start to go forward.
Thanks, Simon. I'm just going to interject there. So in terms of supporting people on flexible working, I think because there's so many different areas of it, it's like you said, there's part-time, there's working 2 days a week in, 2 days, 3 days out. So how do you have any advice on how to manage the many different requirements that your sort of employees might have? So for example, one person might want to find it easiest to work 2 days a week out of the office. It's just trying to like, how do you manage that with there's so many different options for home working?
Well, and home working and working from home are 2 different things as well. So and I think that there are, so let me just start with that actually, because it's a really interesting point. So if you're working from home, there's no fast and hard rules around it, but where we landed with GSK was actually if you're working more than 50% of your time at home, you're classified as a home worker. And if you're a home worker, then actually you're entitled to a whole host and slew of benefits, which would include things like paying towards your Wi-Fi, paying towards some of your household bills like electricity and gas, etc., making sure you've got the right office working space and making sure you've got had a workplace adjustment in place, making sure you've got all the right tools, etc. So there's a whole slew of stuff that comes with home working. Now those rules have been in hiatus while everybody's been working from home, but we're going to be revising that and looking at how do we try and make sure we can come back to that in the future. But when you're talking then about working from home, so working from home and home working and trying to balance all the needs of individuals that are coming back, I think it has to start at a team level. And this is where I think the danger is now that actually we'll have loads of great individual conversations, but actually what we'll end up with is something that doesn't work for the whole organisation. So there are some key rules, I think, really around when you're going through and agreeing any form of flexible working agreement that should be applied across an organisation. One is they have a timestamp. So you should always be able to go back and review it and say, actually, is this working for me? Is it working for you? Is it working for the organisation and the team? So and there's no just because it doesn't work doesn't mean it was wrong for a particular point in time. People's needs will change as they go through their working lives. So having a timestamp there is really, really key. I think also agreeing the rules of the road and being really upfront with people about actually what it is and what it isn't, and actually what the expectations are for that. So, sorry, excuse me. If you think about the classic example of someone moving from full-time to part-time work, the worst of all worlds at the moment is where someone moves from 5 days a week to 4 days a week, and their objectives aren't changed. So in effect, they're having to do 5 days worth of work, but they're only getting 4 days worth of pay, but they get a day off a week. It's completely unfair. So when you're thinking about changing people's working patterns, depending on what it is, you also need to think about the output you are going to be expecting of that individual. So the job may need to be redesigned in order to accommodate the working hours that they're actually going to be working. Mm-hmm. And a final piece there, I think, so the timestamp's important, making sure the job fits the role, particularly if you're starting to change and be flexible about it. But the final piece about it is just being really honest. What you don't want to do is get someone into a flexible working arrangement and set them up to fail. Mm-hmm. When you look at some of the research out there around people who work part-time, they are assessed generally as doing okay rather than ever excelling or underselling. That comes partly back to that job description piece. It's also partly around the expectations, because they're probably being measured against people who are doing 5 days a week. So mm-hmm. there is something there to make sure that we're treating people fairly and equitably and having those honest conversations.
Great, thanks.
Cool. So yes, so supporting the right conversations. So within GSK, what we've been doing is we've rolled out a series of training program. Well, it's a training program for line managers, which is now being trained by people in the business. And they're going through and having these, really giving people pointers and tips around how to have these individual conversations. And then we have what we call an inclusion nudge, which is really like a how-to guide for then the managers then to go off and have conversations within their teams, and really as a team then to start thinking about all those good things that they will need to be able to try and do and how to be able to try and function into the future. Okay, so that's those areas there. Now, we also mentioned some of those conversations before where we're thinking about some of the people who may be disadvantaged certainly by virtual working, and we talked about new starters. We talked about graduates and industrial placement students. We talked about really anybody who's a new entrant into the firm, but there's also team members who you may not be, when you're thinking about cognitive difference and cognitive diversity. Some people are introverts, some people are extrovert, some people have adapted to the digital world, some people haven't. So particularly as a line manager or as an organisation, thinking about how you try and support people who think differently. So how are they engaging with things? Because the danger is that actually we'll start to see people switch off, people who don't want to engage, people who don't want to talk, people who don't like being involved in Zoom calls and things. I've seen it already where people are just sort of declining Zoom calls. They don't know what's to have their video cameras anymore. And you sort of miss that facial interaction, being really thoughtful about actually the way people are interacting and sending messages. There's a lot here that managers need to be able to try and pick up. And we've got some great managers, I'm sure, in all the organisations that we're working in who will just get this and get on with it. There are others who won't. And we need to be cognizant of that and think about how do we try and make sure we can support them as they start to go forward. So this management piece for me is absolutely key.
Right. Oh, sorry, I was just going to quickly, we've had one similar sort of around mental health actually, which does go in quite nicely to that point. So we've had a number of emails asking about your take on the future of the new normal. So sort of any key trends and insights that you're predicting might shape the future narrative of inclusion online, because like you said, different people react to online differently. So we've seen an increase in obviously mental health and stress related illnesses from furloughing and all the issues that come with that. So it'd be good to hear any actionable advice in this area, although you might be coming on to it next, so apologies if you are.
No. It's a very good point, and actually it's picking up on something that I touched on earlier, and it's probably worthwhile just drawing out a little bit more. So certainly one of the negative impacts at the moment has been around people working really, really long hours. So although people are working from home and productivity hasn't dropped, generally people are happier in some of the surveys that have come through so far. There's also research to show that people are working, I think it was in the US that there was a survey that saying that people are working almost an hour extra every day. So they may not be commuting anymore, which is, everybody hates commuting. I don't know anybody who says, do you know what, I love my commute. Now, I know some people like sit and read a book, but basically people are substituting commuting with working. So actually, in effect, they're working longer hours, and partly that's driven by the fact that they can, because actually it's not going to impact. They're not spending any more time, as it were, going to or coming from work. But there can be some really severe repercussions around the fact that people aren't taking breaks. I mean, in the first 6 months of this year, I mean, who went on holiday? No one. No one managed to get away, and it's very rare. Lots of people didn't manage to get away at all, and not being able to take that break. Thoughtful organisations, I know, have been pushing it now. GSK is one where they've been pushing people to make sure that they take a break from work, but there's a real risk of burnout if we don't try and make sure we're intervening, making sure people are getting regular intervals and regular time away from work. So that's super important. Overwork, monitoring the amount of time that people are online. Certainly, anecdotally, the number of emails I've been getting at like 10, 11 o'clock at night from people has just gone through the roof. And it's like people can't switch off. They're not switching off from work. And that's one of the key rules when you're working from home, is you need to have a cut-off point where you stop and you have your home time. Otherwise, the danger is you just mouse wheel into working all the time. And to that way lies madness, literally. It's not a great thing to be doing. So you need to make sure your people are switching off and getting those regular breaks. And that needs to be led really and signposted by management. But it's a super tough time. My read, when you're looking at what's happening from a mental health perspective, certainly before COVID, we've seen increased conversations around mental health. So people and organisations are talking about mental health in a way that I haven't done for ever before. There are some great campaigns out there raising awareness about and trying to break some of the stigma around mental health. My hope is that will continue, and actually it won't be as bad as it could have been. But I still think there's going to be some really, really increased pressure on individuals, particularly when there's a risk of work. You're going to be losing. You could be losing your job again, which will be my real motivator to try and make sure you're carrying on working, you're being seen, you're doing stuff, so you can get into that horrible vicious circle where you're worried about work, you carry on working, you work too much. And take it from me, I've been there. I burnt out. I had a breakdown where basically after I was throwing myself into work. So I can tell you, I've got the T-shirt. Never ever do it. Don't do it. Don't do it.
Well, thanks, Simon.
Great. So I don't want to leave it on that negative note, really, about burning out, and so let's talk a little bit about some areas that we've sort of touched on when we were talking about the team and talking about how we want to try and be able to build back. So these are some of the areas of consideration that we've come through. How do you encourage social interactions? Are there better ways to get things done? So where everything used to be meetings, are there other ways that you can do using SharePoint or Workplace or whatever the tools are that you've got within your respective organizations? How can you try and encourage people to be able to try and use those more effectively? And also, we've been experimenting. Everyone's been experimenting. We've all been doing things slightly differently. What's worked, what hasn't? So some of these things would have worked. Some things are better to be done with the SharePoint. Other things, I think, actually, are better to be done with a meeting. And particularly when it comes to things like training, I think those are things that actually we potentially is better to have people together. And also really just trying to think about what are those rules of the road? How do we want to try and operate going forward? What are the things that we want to try and agree? Come up with a contract, review it recently, or charter about this is what we're going to do, this is what we're going to commit to. And then get your leaders to hold themselves accountable to be able to try and do that. and get your line managers to do the same and cascade that through the organisation, I think you'll see a real change in the culture and a real building of trust as you start to try and build those things through. So final message really is, if we can do this, it's been tough. I mean, everybody I'm sure will share their own war stories around COVID and what it was like during the COVID generation, but we can do this. We can build it back better. We can make it better for people who've got difference. And there's an opportunity here for the organizations that get this right to be able to try and really, really make a difference. So together we really can do that. And I'm open to questions.
Oh, thanks so much, Simon. That was great. We actually have quite a few. I've got a few come through to me on email, and there's some in the chat as well. So there's one just continuing a little bit on the conversation about mental health. So we've seen some excellent stories and examples of brave sort of leaders stepping up to the plate and telling their stories of mental health and wellness, particularly within work. So I think that's really inspired me. I don't know about you, but I think this one key thing that I've taken away from COVID and the home working is it's sort of, because we've all been in it together, it's sort of opened up a new level of transparency, I think, with a lot of people. So I just think, for me, that's one of the main positives of home working. I know there are both, but so in terms of a negative, obviously I don't want to put a negative spin on it, but in terms of the approach to asking about flexible working. So we've had a question here. Do you have any advice on preparing for a flexible working discussion? So although COVID has made it much easier, it may still be frowned upon in some organisations. So this particular individual is going to present to their employer this next week and would like a few tips on sort of approaching it. So how because they don't want to be seen as being not working as hard or sort of lacking. Yeah. Do you have any advice on that area?
Well, so it'd be interesting to see what their leaders and things have been saying during this period where people have been working from home, because I think almost universally from what I've heard, people have been saying that actually this is a really positive thing and actually really encouraging people. So certainly I would go in with that as an opening gambit and talk about, well, John, Jane, whoever has been saying this is a really positive thing, I want to try and carry it on. So I think on an individual basis, have a read of your policy, make sure you know what the policy is out there. I think be clear about what you want to ask for, and don't be afraid to ask for what you want. But also on the flip side, don't be afraid to compromise it to try and get at least part of what you want. So think about what your red lines are. So if you want, and I'm talking, obviously I have no idea about the individual circumstances, if you want to work 3 days a week, go in and ask for 3 days a week, but be prepared potentially to say, actually, they can't afford to lose you for 2 days a week. They don't want you to work for 4 days a week. So is that something you'd be prepared to compromise? So I think role play through what some of the scenarios are and think about what your red lines are. And have those, just be honest about the conversation and about why you think this is going to be a benefit, not only to you, but to the organisation. So think about what benefits they're going to get from you being able to try and work in this flexible way.
Right.
And that can be as simple as just being more engaged. And actually, I'm going to be staying for a while. But I mean, I'm being flippant there. But I think that there's a real value in the fact that actually, if you've got real experience that they want, then actually organisations should be absolutely trying to do this.
Exactly. Thank you. There is one as well around different sectors. I'm not sure whether this is something that you will cover, but basically we've got quite a few attendees from different sectors. I know we've got some from sort of financial services, for FMCG. So it would be interesting to understand how you may approach the learnings with different sectors. So have you seen any trends between different industries or sectors in terms of how well they're doing with home working or not on the other side of things?
So, do you know what I found really interesting is manufacturing. So basically, I think there's a perception that actually manufacturing sites, you've got to be on site all the time. And certainly I think pre-COVID, I think probably most managers and people on a manufacturing site would have agreed with you. What's been really interesting and again, I've been working with GSK on this, but they've been looking at their manufacturing sites, is actually how they've managed to build flexibility in when they're looking at things like training, which previously they'd have everyone on site trying to do. Actually, now they've managed to move that all online. And it means that actually people can actually work from home. So there is some creativity, I think, that's being unleashed here that people probably wouldn't have thought would be able to happen in the past. If I think about what some industries are doing, I think financial services is a really great example. I've got a huge financial services background. So I was talking with a client about some of the work that they were doing, where they are actually having conversations on an individual basis, but with health and well-being. So rather than the GSK approach we were talking about going through with our line managers, they've had their health and well-being teams give everybody in the company a call just to talk them through, actually, how do you want to come back? Are you ready to come back? All of that great stuff in a really, it just sounds like in a very supportive way. I just think that sounds like great best practice to be able to try and do. But trends overall, I think obviously it's much more difficult. I think that the sectors that are suffering the most are the ones where it's going to be more difficult. I mean, the hospitality sector, my heart breaks for them because it's just in a socially distanced world. I mean, they are suffering beyond all measure. So I think it's going to be really tricky for some sectors to be able to try and do this in a really thoughtful way without impacting their business.
Yeah, completely agree, because I think, like you said, like the engagement part is the most important, and it's like it's a lot easier for some sectors than it is others. So I think, like with us at Dial, we are completely remote, and I personally really like it. But you know, like in our conversation yesterday, I was in Manchester in a flat with no garden, and I struggled with that because I didn't have any sort of anywhere to go for a break. So I think it's so many factors that depend sort of on how you are engaged, and I think it's definitely really important for employers to recognise that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so we've had actually just one more quickly come through. So while the current practice of remote working has been highly appreciated, I'm not sure if manager mindset has changed. So if and when we return to normality, then a smiley face, the expectation might just be to come back to work, ? How would you respond to that?
So, well, my hope is we wouldn't come back to it. I think we've managed to prove the fact that flexibility actually works and actually the work gets done. I think hopefully there's been an increase in level of trust between manager and colleagues, so that actually we should be able to go through into the future and be able to agree stuff and stick to it in a way perhaps there might not have been that level of trust before. So maybe my glass is always half full. So I don't think we're going to go back to that situation. I think the organisations that do that and do go back to the way it was, I think are going to lose out on the talent war, because actually I think most people are going to want some form of flexibility going forward. You only have to see the stat that 75-80% of people at the moment, and that was in August when everyone was starting to be encouraged back, we're still working from home at least one day a week. That's a lot, and I can't see that stopping. So I think the organisations that do revert back will lose out on that war of talent. I think that's going to be the key thing for them.
Yeah, brilliant. The other slight point is on sort of face-to-face meetings. I know there is mixed reviews on this, on whether face-to-face is better or virtual. Personally, I do like a mixture because I do miss sort of the physical interaction. But do you think moving forwards it's going to be all meetings? Well, I know it's not going to be the same for everyone, but do you think all meetings will be, or the majority will be Zoom, or do you think take away the face-to-face aspect of meetings?
I hope not. I really do. It's the one thing I really miss is the personal interactions and those social interactions. And I don't really think, even with the best will in the world and coffee buddies and all those things, it's not for me. And actually some people it will. My nephew, like, he loves it. He loves it. He's never been the most social, but working at GitLab's been perfect for him because basically he never has to go in the office. They give him a load of work and he gets on and does it. And he can do it in his own time. Personally, I do get the buzz of creativity out of meeting people and through sessions. I think it's really difficult to do that and recreate that with the way meetings are at the moment. So I don't want to go back to an environment where I'm working all the time from the office. Neither do I want to be working all the time from home. I want to mix. So actually, what I hope would be that actually we've got much more inclusive meetings where actually you can dial in if you want to, or you can be in face to face if you want to. I think that giving people the option is definitely the way to be able to try and go.
Definitely. And I think I really like what you said earlier about the Zoom sort of etiquette, if you like. So some people don't like having the camera on at all, and some people do, which at the start I was like, oh yeah, I love it, I love sort of seeing everyone where I am. But I think after a while you do get a little bit sort of tired of always being on a screen, because I know with me sometimes after work I'm like, oh, I can't look at my phone because I've been looking at the screen all day. But in terms of, I was on a webinar once and I think it was saying about how it may come across unprofessional if you don't put your camera on. But I personally, I don't think it does. I think if someone's more comfortable not being on camera, I think that we should be fine with that.
I think it's personal preference. And you don't know what's going on with people's home lives as well. So we had some really dodgy broadband for an age, so basically I couldn't have any cameras on at all. So I actually quite like seeing people's faces. I think you get more out of it. But again, that's my personal preference. So I would always put my camera on if I can. There's always those odd mornings where you perhaps haven't been quite as well groomed as you would like, so you might not put the camera on. But I think in general, again, that should be personal preference really around whether or not you want to be able to try and do that, or whether you don't. Absolutely.
Yeah. And this is one from me actually, would you think in terms of managing the different sort of requirements of your team, do you think that should come mainly from like the HR function, or whether it's who does that fall under? Because obviously it's quite a new thing to COVID, managing all these different expectations, all these different requirements. Is it a sort of a HR thing, or?
No, so absolutely not. So I think HR can help with setting the guidance and the framework and the support for people. But I think this has to be down to the line managers really to be able to try and manage their team. So they need to be empowered to be able to try and make the right decisions around things, and also to be able to try and support their colleagues in the right way. But it comes back to, at the end of the day, there is a job to be done. So the line manager is the best person to be able to try and identify whether or not the working arrangements or the flexible working arrangements that are in place are going to be able to help them to be able to try and deliver what they need. So thinking about that and making sure that they are still meeting the business need while meeting their colleagues' needs it should be a win-win where it works. There are always going to be occasions where it doesn't work, and actually you can't meet the colleagues' needs in order to be able to try and meet their requirements around flexible working. Unfortunately, that's the nature of the beast within that particular role. So, but we need to make sure line managers have thought very carefully before they turn around and say no to someone who's come forward with a request. Make sure that they've gone through as many different options as they can, so at least they can try and think about meeting people halfway. Saying no is the best way to get someone to leave the organisation or cause trouble or cause problems. Think creatively about how you can try and be able to try and support them.
Thank you, completely agree. I think one person's specifically said they requested flexible working due to personal reasons. Their employer responded that they could not afford the additional costs. But yeah, so any advice on that one? It's quite a hard one to probably.
Well, no, so it's quite, so there are different ways of measuring costs. So it's not just, sometimes it's not just about hours worked. Sometimes cost is measured by FTE or full-time equivalent, so basically about the number of heads you have in the organisation, rather than it being about the hours worked. So sometimes there can be problems around that and the way it's accounted for. I get that, and I've come across that in organisations. My hope is that organisations will be able to flex in order to be able to try and meet it. And certain working patterns sometimes will end up with you. So if you think about having, say, a job share, if you've got one person working 3 days a week, generally then you might have another person working 3 days a week. So you actually have overlap and they can have a handover. Those are the best job shares that I've seen work. Obviously then there's a 20% extra increase in costs. And every time you hire someone, there's a fixed cost that's associated with it. It's the medical benefits and all of that good stuff. So sometimes when you're looking at job shares or splitting roles, there definitely can be an impact from a cost perspective. I think what the organisation needs to do is weigh that up as actually, is this overall going to be a benefit for us as a firm, and can we will the additional output we're getting offset that cost? It's a business decision, and that's why it shouldn't be HR that's sort of ruling on this stuff. It should be the business, because these should be business decisions are being made. Yeah,
thanks, Simon. Just one around recognising what your staff are doing. So in terms of you're not there face to face seeing exactly what people are doing. So I know Zoom is great for meetings and trying to sort of staying connected, but is it really effective in sort of seeing exactly what people are achieving and giving them the praise that they're sort of due? Would you say, is there any way around that?
Oh gosh,
quite a vague question, but
so Zoom, seeing what people are doing and actually tracking performance and actually looking at the way people are being able to try and deliver, obviously depends on what people are being able to try and do. So I know that for the professional consultancy firms or for a law firm, for example, people track everything they do every hour. So actually you can generally see what they're doing and actually track what the performance is. Personally, I find that quite constraining. I would hate that. It would be like, I feel like Big Brother's watching me every hour where I'm going and what I'm doing. I as long as I get the job done, does it matter where I do it or when I do it? Actually, as long as I get what you need done in the time that you set me to do it, then, and I've agreed that I should be able to try and do it, then you should be able to do that. Maybe it's the level of career, the point in the career that I'm at, that actually I've got the luxury of being able to try and do that. Certainly some of the research there was a big research study. The only one that's really been looking at flexible working or home working and was looking at productivity was measuring the output of people in a Chinese call center. So they had a few thousand participants over the course of a couple of years, and they went from being office based to being home based, and it showed, I think it was something like a 15% uptick in productivity with people working from home. And that was just the churn through the calls over a period of time. So, there's good evidence base. I think at least obviously you can't do it on a like for like basis, but there is an evidence base that actually certainly things like call centers actually could work better. When they're first.
I can see why, actually, because I've actually, but one of my first jobs was in a call center, and a lot of it was like sort of the social. You're there, you're like, oh, like you just go and chat to people. But I think when you're home, it's like focused, especially just as calls come in and it like more and more. I think that doesn't surprise me actually on that one. But yeah, I think that is all of the questions that I've got at the moment. But to everyone watching, do you have anything else that you'd like?
No. What I was going to say was if anybody's got any other questions at all, just look me up on LinkedIn. Ask me questions on there. If anybody needs any help in their organisations, again, happy to help if I can. But just drop me a note through LinkedIn, and we can see if we can connect.
Brilliant, thanks, Simon. Everyone watching on demand as well, if you have any questions, just still send them to me on email or through Mighty Networks, and I'll pass them along to Simon and make sure that he gets them as well. But if you are new as well, you can find out everything that we do at www.dialglobal.org. I will send across this presentation, if that's okay with Simon, just so you've got it as sort of like a case study. And again, it would be great if you could connect with Simon on LinkedIn. I'll send his details across. But yeah, thanks again, Simon. And if there is anything else that comes through, I will let you know. It's been really great because I've actually been really interested in this topic, so I'm glad we've had it this week. I know we had a really good conversation about it, didn't we?
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. And listen, thank you very much for having me. Take care. Cheers.
No worries. See you soon. Bye.